In 1849, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, a then 28-year-old ex-engineer with a taste for the lavish lifestyle and one tremendously successful novel behind his back, is arrested for being a part of a literary group which discusses banned books critical of the governing body. For this terrible crime, he is sentenced to death by a firing squad. On December 22nd of the same year, he and several other inmates are taken to a public square in St. Petersburg. The death sentences are read, they kiss the cross, ritualistic sabers are broken over their heads, and they are stood against the stakes where the execution is to be carried out. Dostoevsky is sixth in line when the announcement is made that the benevolent Tsar has decided to pardon their lives and is exchanging their sentences to 4 years in a Siberian prison camp, followed by 6 years of forced military service and exile. The author will be nearly 40 by the time he starts writing again, but this time with a new perspective on life and plagued by debts. In 1865, he writes to an acquaintance with a suggestion for a serialized story to be published in his monthly journal, in which he planned to explore the moral and psychological dangers of the ideology of radicalism. The story is broken down into 12 parts, the first of which is published in the journal in January of 1866, and the last in December of the same year. And its title is Crime and Punishment. It is the middle of January, the wind is blowing, the spirits are low, and the mind wanders. Last night, while rearranging my bookshelves a little bit, I ran into 2 copies of a book I had forgotten I owned. One is beautiful and new and was a gift by a dear friend. The other is old, purchased from an antique bookstore for about $2, and also beautiful, but in the way things with long history are. The 2 books are in 2 different languages, none of which is my mother tongue. The new one is a translation in English, and the old one is in the original Russian. I've cherished both of these books for a long time for very different reasons, and yet read neither of them, and I think it's finally time. But I've waited for so long that now it has to be special. It is a little-known fact, little known mostly because I don't think I've ever really spoken about it, that I used to work as a bartender for about 8 years, many a summer ago, which has left me with tender appreciation for the occasional good drink and admiration of the spirits, and with profound dislike for crowded spaces and partying in general. So, in thinking of a way to honor a classic Russian book, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to do so with a cocktail dedicated to it. Enter the Crime and Punishment. I also like stupid puns if that hasn't become clear yet, so I couldn't not do it. The drink is a variation on the White Russian with the addition of crème du menthe and was featured in Tim Federley's book Cocktails with a Literary Twist, though I'm not sure whether he's the one that actually came up with it. And today we shall try it whilst reading the book that started it all. Now, it's clear probably that I couldn't possibly finish the whole book in tandem with a single cocktail, and I refuse vehemently to suffer any sort of hangover, even for a literary classic of this magnitude. So we'll do this experiment in the span of several days, probably not consecutive days either. We'll try a few different versions of the cocktail, and each time we switch the drink, we switch the copy that I read from, so that I can appreciate Dostoevsky's alleged genius in 3 languages. Why 3, you ask? Well, I actually ran to the library and got myself a Bulgarian copy as well. Please don't be too distressed by its half-digested look. The book has been in circulation in the library since 1978 and continuously changing hands for nearly 50 years will do that to you. You've been warned. And the answer to the inevitable why here is because I can, and because it seemed like a fun idea this morning. Enough foreplay. Let's do the thing, starting with the classical way, build in glass, no frothing of the cream, and we read in Russian. All right, so I've been here for an undetermined amount of time, and I've done some reading and I've done some drinking, and so far the cocktail is not hitting properly for me. I think the cream is way too much. I followed the recipe with the exact amounts given, but I think I'm just gonna reduce it for the next try because this is ridiculous. On top of that, the mint is kind of overpowering everything else. You can't even taste the coffee liqueur at all. And that's not necessarily terrible, but it's not what I came here for, if you catch my drift. So I think for the next time, I'm gonna do less cream and a little more coffee liqueur, and I think that's gonna fix it a little bit. Definitely not an unpleasant experience, and I'm gonna continue drinking it, but for next time, I'm definitely gonna try to improve the recipe, and we'll see how that goes. When it comes to the book, man, is it depressing. The poverty that the author describes can only be done as well as he does it if one has experienced it. The fear of meeting people because you can't afford to pay what you owe, and it's not really fear, it's shame, just the kind of visceral, powerful shame that only comes when you start associating yourself with the poverty. It's no longer that you suffer from poverty, it's that you're now a poor person and you're no longer desirable to the ones around you because of that, or at least that's how one thinks about oneself when one reaches that kind of situation. And the author has done a great job describing that. You can just feel the depression oozing out of the pages of this book. And I know that's not great marketing, but I definitely appreciate it. I think it's well written so far, but man, have I forgotten how to read in Russian. It's been so many years that I hadn't read a full book in the language, and I can kind of feel it right now. It's not that I've fully forgotten it, it's just my brain has lost the habit of turning the words into meaning into my head on that particular language, but it's coming back. Interestingly enough, there are some words in this book that I didn't know the meaning of, but the Russian language, much like the Bulgarian one, is very descriptive, so it's very easy to catch the meaning of a word from context if you know all the words around it, so I'm not having a very hard time with that. I'm gonna continue reading this and I'm gonna update you a little later when I'm done with this and with my reading of this for the day. Do you want to know why Russian literature is difficult to read? I want you to see a paragraph. It starts here and it goes here and here and here and ends all the way over here. This is one paragraph, ladies and gentlemen, on top of a bunch of other difficult things related to this book. Can anybody explain to me why does every human being in these illustrations here look like an eldritch horror? Tell me. So it is many hours later and I am done with reading for the day. I'm just jumping in for a quick update. I'm also done with the cocktail. Definitely not my favorite so far, but we can work on it. About the book, I'm about 80 to 90 pages into it, and well, it's depressing, what can I say? Our main character did something very bad, motivated by a rather interesting take on subjective morality, and I'm going to talk more about it tomorrow because I'm really low on energy right now. One thing I wanted to mention before I forget, and the reason why I'm actually doing this update right now, is that I noticed that the names in this book seem to hold some very interesting meanings behind them, starting with our main character himself and continuing with the rest of the characters. That is something that you won't notice unless you speak the language, but the words that the names are derived from seem to have hidden meaning related to the nature of the people to whom they are assigned, which I find to be a very interesting thing. I'm gonna think about it more when I continue reading, but I did not expect it, and I find it to be a nice touch. It's not a mind-blowing thing by any stretch of the imagination. So that's it from me for now. Day one is over. I'll see you in a second. You know, in the last clip I said tomorrow, but it will be many days yet before I pick up the camera again and start filming for this reading experiment. In the meantime though, I actually continued reading the book, mostly in Russian, but also a little bit in English and a little bit in Bulgarian. And I have to be honest, switching between the three different editions left me a little bit unsettled and kind of confused at times, but it was also strangely helpful to immerse myself in the story and see it from a few different points of view because the three different languages are so different in their expression. In the last last clip, I also mentioned something related to the names and the hidden meanings behind them, and I wanted to give one particular example, and that is our main character, Raskolnikov. And the word Raskol, from which the name is derived in Russian, and in Bulgarian for that matter, literally means a split from the church, a schism in a way. And we see him as the protagonist being split between his utilitarian beliefs and compassionate morality based on principle. And I think we all as people are way too familiar with this feeling, and I believe often it is the main source of our unhappiness, even if we don't always know to put the exact name to it. After all, cognitive dissonance is often an unseen and very unwelcome companion in our lives. Alright, so it's been a while. I don't even remember when was the last time I filmed, but it was definitely more than a week ago. The truth is that the month kind of got away from me yet again, but we can still salvage the situation because I have been reading the book, and I can't say that I've been enjoying it because I don't know that you can honestly say you're enjoying something that's putting you on the verge of existential crisis. To be a little more dramatic than the reality, but I definitely appreciate the book and the results that it could have on me in the long term. Maybe. But today, whatever the hell of January it is, I have some time, so I'm gonna make myself a cocktail and I'm gonna do some reading, but this time in English. He was standing, hat and gloves in hand, but before departing he felt disposed to throw off a few more intellectual phrases. He was evidently anxious to make a favorable impression. How to call someone a pompous fool without using any of those words. By the way, there are a lot of historical events that are referenced in this book, and if you're not familiar with them, you might have a bit of a difficult time relating to the story, because while the editors and translators have done a pretty good job explaining them in the footnotes, if you don't have at least a bit of knowledge about them, you might have a bit of a difficult time understanding their significance for the context of the story. Not that you need to know all the Russian history in order to understand the book per se, it's just one extra thing to make you appreciate it more. Also, I think this version of the cocktail is so much better. I modified it slightly by putting equal amounts vodka and coffee liqueur and a little bit less cream, but I frothed it a little bit in the shaker with some ice, and it increased the volume slightly. And you can feel the slight bitterness of the coffee liqueur a little bit more, and I think it mingles nicely with the rest of the taste. I think it's well balanced with the mint, and while this is still not my cocktail per se, I like it much better than the previous version, and I'm enjoying it way more. Alright, I had to move because the sun was burning right through me, but I found a passage in the book that left me absolutely stunned. It's so beautiful, and I actually switched to the Russian version because I wanted to read it in the original language, and I'm gonna read it to you right now, and I'm gonna put the translation on the screen. «Где это?» — подумал Раскольников, идя далее. «Где это я читал, как один приговоренный к смерти за час до смерти говорит и думает, что если бы пришлось ему жить где-нибудь на высоте, на скале и на такой узенькой площадке, чтобы только две ноги можно было поставить, а кругом будут пропасти, океан, вечный мрак, вечное уединение и вечная буря, и оставаться так, стоя на вершине пространства всю жизнь, 1000 лет, вечность, то лучше так жить, чем сейчас умирать. Только бы жить, 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 как бы не жить, только жить. Экая правда». You know, it's so powerful because you know that the author has actually lived this exact moment, staring at the barrel of a rifle, so to speak, maybe even literally. And those thoughts have been in his mind in that exact moment, so he has described them so perfectly here on page. It's inexplicably, hauntingly beautiful because it's true. It's been a week again. I have no excuse. Plus, you can't really tell, so who cares? I have been reading the book. I'm about 80% into it, and I am loving it? Question mark. Again, I don't know that you can honestly say that you love something that's making you feel so much inner turmoil. But this is a very good story, and it's told very well, and it doesn't even matter how it's gonna end because the whole substance of it so far has been so fantastic. I realized that I never really spoke about the plot of the book besides the initial little introduction that I made. In a very tiny nutshell, our main character killed someone and is now being destroyed by guilt, which is basically the bigger part of the punishment that he suffers, at least so far. This is obviously very oversimplified and the most obvious point of the plot, but there's a lot else going on, including a love story, familial relationships, friendships, rivalry, general societal stuff, and the investigation of the police, obviously. And there is much more going on. I am terrible with summaries, frankly, and that's only one of the reasons why I generally don't do plot summaries whenever I recommend books. I understand that that's not always helpful because people sometimes prefer to pick the books that they read based on the subject matter, but I don't think this should be applicable for classics of this magnitude specifically because this is not a book that you read for the tropes or the plot preferences that you have. You read this book because this book is very important. It has proven itself as a worthy read across generations basically, so I think its plot should be irrelevant in your decision making for whether to read it. Now, it's time for us to try yet another version of the cocktail and to finally read the book in Bulgarian officially. You know, the book would be super serious for a very long time. Our characters would have very serious inner thoughts, and then we'd run into what I can only describe as a domestic scandal that any soap opera would be happy to include in its plot. It's a rather entertaining dumpster fire, is what I'm trying to say. I think I managed to finally nail the recipe. I'm gonna call this the perfect crime, and I'm gonna put the proportions on the screen. Enjoy. Did you know, by the way, that the White Russian was invented as a cocktail back in the middle of the 20th century, but it was actually popularized by the Big Lebowski movie because the dude loved drinking White Russians. That's a movie I haven't seen in so many years. I'd totally forgotten the entirety of the plot, and I probably didn't get it back in the day, so maybe I should try and watch it one of these days. Alright, I am nearing the ending of this book, and I'm really liking where it's going. I'm really hoping the author will stick the landing. Honestly, he couldn't possibly go wrong unless he makes it too flowery and too happy of an ending, which I think we all know is not gonna happen. Because let's face it, this is a Russian book and they never have happy endings. One thing I noticed is that Dostoevsky makes really good arguments for the point that he's ultimately arguing against. He's not ridiculing it, he gives it a fair chance, and then he demolishes it in an underhanded kind of way, or rather lets you demolish it in your mind. And although he makes his biases clear, he's very subtle in that. I quite like this sort of approach. It's not something that you see very often, especially these days. Also, one more thing, most of the chapters here seem to end on a cliffhanger, and I suppose that's because this was published as a serial initially and he was trying to make sure that the readers are coming back for more. Although if people were coming back for more of this back in the day, there must have been a serious lack of entertainment. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is an entertaining book, but it's also a cluster swamp of depression dressed in philosophy. Definitely my kind of thing. Okay, so I finished the book earlier today and I think I'm gonna give it 5 stars. I took some time to put my thoughts in order, and while I love where the book ended ultimately, I kind of wish the author hadn't written that epilogue. I think this sort of story would do a bit better with a bit of ambiguity when it comes to the ending. I think for a full effect, the reader should be allowed to make their own conclusions. And I also think I need to mention that I was a bit influenced by the fact that I'm familiar with the author's life story story, and that made everything that happened here a bit more impactful. I still think I might have given the book 5 stars had that not been the case, but I think it's important that I mention it here. So, should you read this book? In a word, yes, but it does depend on where you are in life. That's not to say that there's one moment in life when you're destined to read this book and you won't appreciate it otherwise, but the book does require turmoil in order to make the biggest impact. Now, you don't have to be in any sort of turmoil yourself at the moment, but you do have to be able to consider it and kind of put yourself under its influence. I don't know that I'm entirely making sense to you right now, but the thing is, the author wrote this book with a lot of passion and he put a lot of effort giving voice to both sides of a very specific argument related to morality. And to me, in order to really appreciate it, you have to be willing to put a lot of effort yourself. Recently, I've had some hard time making peace with one particular aspect of my reality, and I've been kind of seeking solace in the consideration of what is right and good, and the knowledge that my pain is ultimately for the good of somebody else. I guess it helps, though often it doesn't feel that way, because one instinctively believes that if something is good and right, it will feel right. And right now, it doesn't feel that way. Maybe it never will, but it's good to consider. Books like this one get us to consider, even if not on the same topic. I find it comforting to observe moral dilemmas dressed in human stories, however distant they are from what we are going through. The book is well written, and the translation both in English and in Bulgarian was fantastic, and even though I favor the Bulgarian one slightly more because of linguistic and cultural similarities, I think the English one makes it sound a bit more gentle and aesthetic. And I don't think you'd lose anything of tremendous substance if you read the book in English. The humanity behind the story is universal. Though I would recommend you look up some of the names and the meanings behind them. There is subtle symbolism there which probably won't blow your mind, but will give you an extra layer of appreciation for the story. I guess the conclusion is, the book is good. What a unique revelation. The book is good and uncomfortable, so I recommend you read it when you're already uncomfortable. And the cocktail was good as well. I'm not a big fan of too sweet, minty, nor creamy cocktails in general, but I like this one. I'd give it 7.5 out of 10. Randomly. I hope you enjoyed watching this video because I definitely enjoyed filming it, and I'm thinking of making it a series, something like Cocktails and Old Tales. Now that I say it out loud, I realize there could be some misunderstanding with this title, so maybe not that. Maybe something like Literary Libations or something else extremely pretentious. I don't know, leave your suggestions in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to see some of my other weird reading experiments, check out this playlist. Bye!